I'm a female in my late 20s. My parents are a charming lesbian couple who own a funeral home and a cemetery in a village on the outskirts of the Alaskan tundra. It was a small business that had been passed down from my mother, Agatha's father, who inherited it from his father, and so on. Katie, my other mother, was terrified of the whole situation from the beginning. She was positive that someone would get possessed with us living so close to a field of corpses, which were her words exactly. Over time, exactly 8 years after they moved there, she grew to respect the land as well as the tenants resting in peace there. I was born shortly after her change of heart, but she still limited my access to the cemetery. And while no one was ever possessed, we still had our fair share of terrifying experiences at our home and throughout the property. I went to a tiny schoolhouse every weekday from the time I could walk. Only 30 or so children lived in our town, so we were all educated in one room by a small group of teachers. Katie and her twin sister Gloria were 2 of these teachers. The 3 of us would walk to and from the town every day while Agatha and her brother Cal took care of the property. It was a 20-minute trek, but on the occasional day without freezes, we got to take our bikes, and that was generally the highlight of my life. However, on this particular day in December, we had to walk. We were only at the school until about 4 o'clock that afternoon, but the sun usually set around 330, so we were shrouded mostly in darkness by the time we got to the dirt road leading up to our property. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and I still used my clumsiness as an excuse not to walk up the path muddied by snow. Glory had drawn the short straw and was giving me a piggyback all the way up the hill. I was resting my head against her back and staring at the cemetery that was beginning to come into view around the paper birches and spruce trees. It was a sprawling field filled with an odd assortment of mausoleums and colorful tombs of Inuit and the Russian Orthodox citizens. I was always entranced by the graves and tried to pick out ones that I had yet to see. We were nearly to the house when I saw a figure standing in the far right corner of the cemetery. It was hard to discern their age or gender, but I could tell from the build that it wasn't Agatha or Cal. Visiting hours ended at sundown, regardless of the date, so I immediately pointed to the person and asked Katie who that was. Now, most of the finer details are recalled by my parents and older family members due to my young age throughout the most of these events, but I can still clearly remember hearing Katie mutter crap quietly under her breath. She helped me off Glory's back and ordered that I go inside to tell Cal to meet them in the field. Without hesitation, I suddenly found myself as sure-footed as a bunny on the icy ground and sprinted the last 20 or so yards up to the house. I swung the door open and went into the kitchen, where I knew I'd find Aga and Cal, and told my uncle to get the trespasser. Groaning, Cal finished his cup of coffee, which was probably spiked with whiskey, and stood up from the table. Cal was a big guy, maybe about 6'8", with broad shoulders and what I call Fred Flintstone fist. Basically, he could knock someone out with not much effort, and he did so time to time. He was insanely protective of his sisters and all of the other women in his life, Glory and Katie included. The entire town respected him and feared him at the same time. He was a nice at-home security system. Naturally, I was thrilled with this tiny bit of excitement in my normally hummed, run life. When my uncle charged out the back without so much as a coat on, I turned my pleading eyes to Aga, who barely flinched at the activity. She stared back at me for only a moment before sighing and motioning to the rack by the door. I grabbed her parka and helped her put it on as we made our way outside. Knowing that her wife was going to be none too thrilled with my presence in the cemetery, Aga picked me up and we reached the cast iron fence that surrounded the property. We could see Cal's giant silhouette approaching the tiny ones of Katie and Glory. The stranger was still a good 100 or so yards from all of us. "Let's hide and watch," I whispered to Aga when I realized that Katie hadn't spotted us yet. For a moment, I thought my mother would shake her head and go to the others, but she surprised me by giving me a conspiring smile and ducking behind a mausoleum. "We can get to grandmother's grave if we are very quiet," she told me with a glint in her eye. She loved the graveyard and had spent her childhood playing in it, while also learning about her ancestors and the other people of her town. She wanted me to enjoy it as much as she did. We hurried from grave to grave, pausing only long enough to make sure that the others didn't see us. Katie, Gloria, and Cow were moving swiftly as well, but they were too busy eyeing the figure, standing only about 20 feet from the large tomb that encased my great-grandmother, our destination. When we arrived at the tomb, Aga set me down, and we crouched behind the rocks and the wood that surrounded my grandmother's altar. It was then that I began to feel nerves eat away at my gut. This was a stranger. I could tell they were standing at a base of a mausoleum built to honor the infants who had passed before being blessed by the tribe's shaman. This was an old, outdated site that didn't fully honor Inuit customs, though, and it had been redone in 1970, closer to the northern section of the property. No one came to this site because it would be considered disrespectful to their deceased, but it would have been just as disrespectful to tear it down. So it was just a derelict memorial that loomed on the tiny hilltop of that section of the cemetery. Tension filled the air as Cal, flanked by Katie and Glory, approached the stranger. I could hear my uncle speaking to them, likely telling them the hours were over and asking him if they'd like a ride back out of town. He always started off nice, giving people the benefit of the doubt before going into Hulk mode. Aga had initially been giggling at the side of her brother, looming over the trespasser. She was beginning to cling tighter onto me as time went on. It took us a few minutes to realize the person hadn't been responding to Cow, nor had they even looked his way. They just continued to stare at the area just above the mausoleum. Katie and Glory were exchanging uneasy glances, and at one point Cal told them to go back to the house. They refused to step closer to his side. When words failed, Cal resorted to physical approach. He later recalled that he couldn't tell the person an old man was frail and he didn't want to hurt him, but he wasn't listening, and if he was deaf, he would have to get his attention somehow. My uncle placed a gentle hand on the gentleman's shoulder, and immediately he felt a wave of nausea overcome him. He hunched over, clutching his abdomen, and cried out. Aga ordered me to stay put before darting out from behind the stones and over to her brother, who waved her and the other woman off. He insisted that they go inside, but they were all frozen in place. The strange man still hadn't moved, so Katie yelled at him once more. She stepped around in front of him and waved a hand in his face. "You need to leave," I'd heard her command. "You cannot be here after dark. It's not safe." "No, it's not," the stranger finally said. He lowered his eyes to smile at my mother. "Are you all right, dear?" He spoke so casually to her that she stood there in shock. For a good moment. She looked back to Cow, who was on his knees at this point. While she was distracted, the man turned towards the exit. When he was coming towards my hiding spot, I had every intention of getting up and running away, but I was frozen in place. It felt like my body was being held down by weights and I was sinking into the earth. I whimpered and buried my face in my arms, praying to God and my great-grandmother for safety. The ice and leaves crunched in my ears, and I knew Aga realized my predicament and said something to the others because I could hear Katie shouting at her. Finally summoning the courage, I looked up to see the man walking right by me. He didn't so much as look my way, but as he passed, he said, "Good night," blue eyes in a dulcet whisper. Immediately, I relaxed and climbed to my feet. I watched him practically float out of the cemetery and towards the road. Katie came and got me, telling me that we had to take my uncle to the hospital. As it turns out, Cal had to go in for an emergency surgery because his appendix had ruptured. He's convinced the old man somehow cursed him. Even Aga, sweet but superstitious Aga, had her doubts about his claims. There was nothing malicious in Cal's approach to the man, so why would he have cursed him? Nothing makes sense anymore. Everything is confusing. But I never did see that man on my property again. I was a little sad about it, but the adults were all glad. A decade ago, my ex-wife and I rented an apartment from an elderly lady. We lived upstairs and she lived downstairs. It was huge, an enormous living room, 2 decent-sized bedrooms, and access to the attic for storage. Her son gave us a great discount on the rent because we kept his mom company. We also did odd jobs for her, such as mowing and taking out her garbage. It was an awesome arrangement for a young married couple just getting on their feet. Now, a bit of information on the house itself. It had been built in the late 1800s on the edge of an old cemetery. The cemetery was torn up in the early 1900s to make room for the growing city around it. All of the graves had been relocated to a new cemetery on the outskirts of the city, but rumor had it that a few of the graves were left behind. The whole situation was straight out of the plot of Poltergeist. Digging up cemeteries never seems to go well with the spirits, I guess. We lived in the apartment for several months before any activity started. It began with subtle creaking in the hallway outside of our bedroom. It sounded like footsteps that would pace back and forth down the long hallway. The floor in the hallway was hardwood, so the creaking was quite audible. At times I would rush out of the bedroom expecting to find an intruder or burglar, but no one was ever there. This happened every night without fail. Eventually, we would just lay there in bed, frozen with fright. There was not much else we could do, honestly. After several months, the activity took on a new behavior. The footsteps would now stop in front of the bedroom door for a few moments before going back to the pacing. Sometimes the doorknob would rattle a bit, as if someone was trying to turn it. This occurred nightly for several months, but luckily the door never did open. One time when I got up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, I saw a pair of translucent legs. There was nothing above the waist walk past our bed and straight into the wall. It startled me, but I tried my best to brush it off. One time we left a digital recorder running while we slept and caught a creepy male voice stating that it was in the bedroom with us. My ex-wife and I managed to live there for 2 years. When we finally moved out and we were carrying out the last of our stuff, the old lady downstairs asked us if we were moving because of the ghost. When we were silent, not knowing how to respond, she told us that she was fully aware that the house was haunted. She told us that her family had been upstairs in the past to bless and exorcise the apartment. They had gone through all of the rooms with holy water while reading various Bible verses. Obviously, it just didn't work. This helped validate that our experiences were not the products of overactive imaginations. Other people had experienced these spirits as well. I still wonder to this day if this ghostly activity was related to the old cemetery that had once bordered the house. I wonder if the disturbed graves have caused unrest in the spirits, unrest that lasted for a century. I sincerely hope that these spirits will find peace one day. I'm from Saluda, South Carolina, a very old and rural country town steeped in Indian history. My grandparents are descendants of sharecroppers that have been on the land for over a century and a half. We used to go from the city to the country every summer, from Atlanta to South Carolina. In the country, it was a very set schedule. Wake up, eat, go outside to play, come back at noon to eat, and then go back out to play. No in and out. Dust comes in, you wash up, eat up and pray and go to sleep. My brother and I would run off into the field and play all day. We'd skip rocks at lakes, shoot squirrel and rabbit with BB guns, eat berries and all sorts of fun. Well, in one particular part of the pasture, there was a circle of trees and bushes that even the cows didn't go in. Our grandmother told us that it was an Indian graveyard and we were to stay out of it. It was off limits. Every summer we went up to South Carolina. My brother and I got closer and closer to the strange place. We could see staffs and hanging skulls and feathers and strange tombstones and crows that were there. There were artifacts all around. It seemed like the closer we got, the eerier it became. We would hear sounds of drums being beaten, see apparitions of chief-like looking men. And in the distance, we would hear what sounded like eagles or hawks. Sometimes we would even see them fly overhead cawing as we got ready to enter the patch. Well, we told our grandmother about it, and she told us to stay out of there as we would disturb the dead and bad things would happen. Being a kid, I was hard-headed. And one day, coming back from the pond fishing, I walked past the cemetery. I ran up to it, slowing down the closer I got. And I could see all the same stuff: the staff, the feathers, the Indian arrowheads, the bones. At this time, I grabbed one of the arrowheads and ran back to the house. I got in, I went into my room to examine it, and my grandma yelled, "Y'all better get ready for lunch." I stashed the arrowhead under my mattress before I could even look at it. I ate my food, and after eating, my grandma was in the kitchen and said, "Son, I told you to stay out of that cemetery." I said it wasn't in a, Grandma. She said, "Yes, you were. I know you were." I got silent and thought, how did she know you stay out of that cemetery? I said, "I wasn't in a, Grandma," and she said, "Yes, you were." So I stopped arguing with her. We were just going in circles. You can't even see the cemetery from the house, nor any vantage point. She hasn't been in any room because she has been in the kitchen since I came in. After I finished eating and was about to head out, she said, "If you got anything from there, you better take it back." I said, "No, ma'am, I don't," and hurried out the door. And as I played for the remainder of the afternoon, I felt so uneasy. How did she know what was going to happen? Later that evening I came in, washed up for dinner, sat and ate. It was rather silent this night. I sensed an odd feeling. My brother and I said prayers and we were off to bed. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear little noises and thought it must be the old mouse that scurries along the wall down the hall. At night, as I was dozing off, my eyes got heavy and I saw my grandma coming down the hall. But as she got closer, it wasn't her. This person had the face of a wolf or a demon with stringy clothes on. It walked straight into the room and got on my bed. I tried to scream, but I could not. I tried to call for my brother, who was onto the top bunk, but my mouth was covered by the thing. It was laughing and sobbing in my mouth over the top of me. I thought I was going to die. I was scared senseless. I passed out as it choked me to sleep. The next morning I woke up to my brother saying it was time to eat and to come on. He hopped down and ran for the bathroom, thinking I was going to chase him for who's first, like every other morning. But I was still in shock. When I finally got to the table, my grandma asked, "How did we both sleep?" My brother said that he had an awful dream, that something had broke in. Not a person, but something that was just something he couldn't remember. As I went to blurt out my dream, my grandma said, "Hush, you. Like yesterday at lunch. I told you to stay out of the cemetery." She said, "Whatever you took from there, you need to return it. I can't take it back, nor can your brother, or otherwise your dreams will get worse till you wake up in the cemetery."